It's great to be here. Thank you very much, Hunter. It's a pleasure to be talking to you today in the group. Hopefully, I'll be able to live up to your intro and give the team some ideas and thoughts as they go forward.
Absolutely. Well, that was just the tip of the iceberg, my friend. I'm very excited to jump in with you. First off, before we jump in, thank you for your service, sir. It is an honor to have you here. So thank you for making the time as well. Can you start off by telling us a bit about yourself? I kind of gave a little bit about you in there, your military service, and anything else you'd like to add about your role at United Health Group.
Sure, great. Yeah. So as you said, I spent 20 years in the U.S. Air Force, primarily in aircraft maintenance, which I think is important to point out because, as you said, I'm in healthcare, which has nothing to do with aircraft maintenance. And I began my journey just about 10 years ago. I retired out of Belgium. So I moved back to California where our family wanted to move, where our family is from, and where my wife and son wanted to move. So I knew I was going to have to find a job local as opposed to moving to a job. And I had kind of narrowed down my hunt to work in healthcare, non government aviation, or operations manufacturing. And I ended up in healthcare. I actually started out as an individual contributor, right? Not in a leadership role, and in the quality space. About 8 weeks after I moved into that role, I got asked to move into a leadership role, leading a team that had some struggles. I didn't really know what they were going to need because I was brand new to the private sector still, but I figured I should try to help and see what I could do. From there, I took on successive roles within Optum RX, which is the pharmacy benefit manager and pharmacy services arm of UnitedHealth Group. Did that for about 9 years, and then recently moved over to Optum Financial Services, which is the banking arm. Most people don't know, and I didn't know until maybe a year or two ago that UHG actually had an FDIC bank, and I moved into the contact center and running that. It's about a 3,000 person team that handles about 20 million calls, emails, and chats a year. So not only I'm in healthcare now, I'm also in banking, running a contact center. None of which I did in the U.S. Air Force, right? So it's been quite a journey. 10 years. So I have the 20 years in the Air Force, and then 10 years here, so a total of 30 years. But I guess after 10 years now, I feel pretty comfortable in talking about these things and have been working. And I appreciate the rundown of those areas that for a number of years, really trying to bring the best talent possible to United Health Group. That's what I always lead with. And two, especially for veterans hiring and also disability, which is not why we're here today. So the veterans and spouse, really trying to help veterans get hired into the private sector, whether it's United Health Group or not, and connecting with people that I know in other organizations, try to help them, because the goal is to try to find veterans and spouses the best fit, which may or may not be United Health Group for their career path.
Right. That's so amazing to hear the twists and turns and unexpected industries that you are now a professional in, and you didn't even know some of these things existed before. So I find that very inspiring.
Thanks. Well, it was interesting, and I won't take too much on the history, but when I was in Optum RX, I actually ran one of our pharmacies. I'm not, obviously not a pharmacist. So even within that space, I actually spent almost 2 years running one of our acquisitions on the operations teams. Had pharmacy dispensing. So yeah, it's a lot of different things out there, which I'm glad you point out. It shows the twists and turns you can take in a civilian career, which is much different than the military, where I followed very much traditional path. Everyone has different ways to get that traditional path, but I followed a very traditional how you would go progress as a maintenance officer in the United States Air Force. So I'm glad you pointed out that there's twists and turns in the private sector, because 10 years ago I would not have thought I'd be running a contact center at United Health Group in a bank.
Right? Yeah. If you somehow future you are like, this is what you're gonna do, you're like, are you kidding? Why?
Would have never guessed. Would have never guessed.
Yeah, I love that. So related, so what, there's so much that you couldn't have anticipated, right, on this career. So what would you say are some common misconceptions that veterans have looking to move into civilian careers?
Well, I think the first thing is they feel they're going to find the perfect role. And I
Mm.
tell people, I don't know that that really exists. Things like a unicorn or urban myth, right? I said, I think you need to find a role that meets your needs and you need to define needs. In fact, I tell people, veterans and spouses, I said, you need to define success. Don't let someone else define that success for you. Because if you let someone else define it, you may not end up in a role that's happy that you're happy with. The other thing I really kind of pass on is it's important, especially transition military, you know what you don't want to do. Even if you know what you may not know what you want to do, you say, these are things I don't want to do. And I think that's really critical to know. So I think those are kind of two things I would pass on as you're doing that transition, from the military. And I think they apply to spouses also, just a little bit differently, but they also apply to the spouses.
I think that's really good advice because, again, as you have pointed out, there's so much out there that we can't anticipate. But if you do start to limit at least what you don't want to do, that will save folks a lot of time and headache, I imagine.
And one example I give, and it should be fairly comprehensive, living in Southern California where traffic is a lot. And I live in Orange County, right? So south of Los Angeles, for those who don't know it. And there was someone said, I can get you an interview at SpaceX, which is up in Hawthorne, which is, as you know, probably 20 miles, 30 miles from where I'm in Orange County. And I would love to work for SpaceX. I had some space experience there for I said, but I will not commute. Like that was, if I hadn't listed what I didn't want to do, I actually said I don't want to go farther north than southern Long Beach.
Mm-hmm.
Because I'm like, I said, it doesn't matter how great the role is, how fulfilling the job is. Spending 3 hours in traffic would negate all of that, right? So that's why I really do think it's important for people to understand. Again, that's just, that is one example about community, but there's, again, I talked about industries, right? I said I wanted to work in a certain industry. I also said, I didn't want to work in defense or government. I could have just stayed in the Air Force for 10 more years. So again, that's where I help define that, right? So again, I think really important as you're looking through those factors.
Those are so important. I'm born and raised in Los Angeles, so I
Oh,
know
you're familiar.
exactly what you're talking about.
Okay. I'm like, well, it seems to be resonating with you. So you got the geographical
Oh,
quiz.
yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
I lived all the way out in the sticks, but I went to a very cool arts high school, but it was an hour and a half drive each way
Yeah.
on at rush hour both ways. So it
Yes.
was bananas and I had to really want it. And I was a kid, so it was different. But those, like you said, like that's 3 6 hours a day. That's cutting into family time, right? That's
Right.
cutting into your priorities that are outside of your work, and that would drain you, that would make you less happy at your job, maybe even resentful at your work because you're missing out on some of your core you know some of your core wants and needs.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I love too how simple that is too. You're like, I don't want to commute. And I love how simple it can be. It made me think of like sometimes if I don't know what I want to eat, is like, well, do I want something hot or do I want something cold? And it's
Right.
just like making it as simple and you're like, oh, that now makes this entire category clear to me.
Right. And that's what you're really trying to do, whether you're getting out after 4 years or 30 years. If you're a spouse looking for a role, you're trying to simplify the process because, I always tell people you don't have to get all of the jobs. You just need to get one of the jobs. And there's tens of millions of jobs open at any time in the US, and you have to narrow it down to something that you can actually look for.
Yeah. So let's say now you're helping someone, they've narrowed it down to what they don't want to do. How can veterans optimize their strengths to highlight their skills they learned during their time in the military to help them focus on what jobs they might want to apply for?
So first is understanding what skills that they have and translating those for people who don't have a military background can understand, right? So aircraft maintenance, probably some of the skills were easier. I'm not working airplanes, but at least some of the concepts. But I gave an example in my interview, which I think is which is really simple. I started, as I mentioned, on the quality team, right? Quality is a very transferable skill. Training is a very transferable skill. And in the interview, it said, how would you adapt? I said, have you ever had an airplane fly over your head? They said, yes. I said, are you okay with parts falling off? Like, no. I said, that's why quality is important. I said, that's how it translates over. And they got it, right? And then it made the whole discussion as I was giving them examples. They saw how the ability to improve processes or measure processes or drive improvements, how I could apply those skill sets I learned in a aviation hands-on touching to a more transactional based UnitedHealth Group role. They could see that. So, but that's incumbent on the person to do that. I also try to show skill sets that I could have for future, right? It wasn't just I have these additional skills if I needed. I didn't know I would end up using them so quickly after I got hired. But you always want to be thinking to the future. I always tell folks, where do you want to be in 5 or 10 years? Doesn't mean you need to have a detailed plan, but make sure you're taking those steps. I laid out, here's the things I can do as the organization grows, as the department grows, that I can provide that additional value to the organization. So so you have to translate those skills so they can understand, because it's incumbent on, always tell veterans and spouses, it's incumbent on you, not the reader, not the interviewer. It's our job to translate those skills so they can see our value.
That's such good advice. And what I love about the examples example is that it does two things. One, you're translating, and two, you're sharing your story with them as well
Right.
in ways that they would never understand if you didn't bring it up.
Right. In our transition assistance program, one thing they said is, you maybe don't so much share your story, because the military very much talks, as we talking to people, it's mostly about the story, not about the job, because the people in the military understand the job, right? But I felt to be one of the strengths I think we bring from the military is who we are as part of that. And I have found talking about those things, even in interview process, was powerful, as opposed to totally not talking about that, only focus on job, trying to translate. I think that was certainly then and still now, that 20 years in the military is a part of me, and explaining it in that context, I think, was important.
Yeah, absolutely. So are there any other things that in the interview process that you would suggest folks that they highlight as well if they're in that room, and any other tips?
I think the other thing is you want to show that you're prepared to work in the private sector, right? And adjust to that you're fitting into their culture. Your expectation is not to have them fit into your old culture. What was really interesting is they actually asked me in our interview, because I had always led teams uh, up to and close to 1,000 people. They said, and I had never been an individual contributor, right? There were certain roles that I guess in the Air Force would have resembled an individual contributor. I always had at least direct reports in every role. And they said, "Are you okay now leading people?" And I gave a very honest answer. I said, if this is what the organization needs, and I can provide value, I said, having my job be meaningful and be able to do it effectively and helping change, that's way more important to me than leading people, right? So I would say also, I addressed the elephant in the room, right? I tried to show I was ready for this role. The other thing, and I think this is still very valid, that because of the military environment, when you're asked to do something, they can ask anyone to do anything. And while it's appreciated in the military environment, I'd say it's appreciated in the civilian environment to a degree, when you're applying for a role, they want to know if you want to do that job for
Mm-hmm.
them. And that's why I was clear, is I want to do this job for you. If you choose to ask me to do something else down the road, that's fine, but I'm here for this role. I think that's really, really important. And that also shows your ability to transition to what the organization and the private sector is asking for from you, versus, well, I'll do anything. Like, well, we don't do anything. We have this one role. We want someone who wants to do this.
Right. That's so important, to be clear, concise, and prepared, and confident, it sounds like, too, in knowing what you want to do.
And I will give kind of a funny story from the interview. So I had two interviews. So the first one, they said, describe a process improvement event. I said, hey, can I use the whiteboard and draw it? So I got up there and drew it, and it was really interesting. And then, you remember, this is my first interview ever in my life because I spent my whole career in the Air Force. And prior to that, what I'd done, I was a teenager in the 80s, so which dates me. You went to McDonald's, you put an application, they hired you. And I worked there for 2 years, and I worked as a construction worker during college. So you didn't have an interview process. And the corporate recruiter called back and said they definitely want to push you to the next round. But they said you're very assertive, right? Which they said they love. They said like you jumped up there and took charge, right? Which I think was very much our training, right?
Yeah.
So I took that feedback. The next one, I did go on the board and draw again, but I was a little more subdued, which actually probably helped because they showed my ability to adjust to feedback. Of course, I said, well, I worked on airplanes, so I always had like an outside voice. But I tried to adapt and take that feedback.
I love that story because it shows so much about you that you're willing to take a chance. You communicated in the way that helped you communicate. And then when you came back and that was recognized. And then when you came back for the second round, you had some feedback, you took the note, you dialed it back a little bit. And you, like you said earlier, you met them a bit more where they
Right.
are, right? You let the reader into your story as opposed to pushing it on them. I love that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So we have about 10 minutes left. So we all know that networking is very important. We know that a lot of jobs sometimes aren't even listed, and folks get hired through their network. And coming back, once you're in civilian life, I imagine that it can be maybe a little confusing as to like where to go, how do you network, who do you network with? What recommendations and tips and resources would you recommend for folks that are veterans that are transitioning into the workforce to increase their network, and if there's any organizations that you would recommend that they check out?
Yeah, I'm going to give a few examples. So first, if you're part of any professional, like your job has if you're a program manager, PMI, if you're in quality, American Society of Quality, if you're engineer, Professional Engineering Society, whatever it is, join those organizations, right? That is a really good way of like getting connected to people that do the same role. The second is use LinkedIn. Goal is not to be LinkedIn famous, right? The goal is to have meaningful connections. And because you're come from the military, most of your learning is military. I found it a very, very useful tool to read articles and learn about the private sector, right? It helped educate me where I had a gap in knowledge. And not only is it good about networking and meeting people and getting ideas and exchanging ideas, I'd read the articles. It was educational. Last, within your company, take the opportunity to meet people in your area, outside of your area, who share your interests, right? So spend that time. Not I caution against people like always looking for the next job, because that comes across a little bit odd, right? Look to make those meaningful connections and learn and ask, tell your story, learn their story. And that is that continuing learning after you leave the military. So one, look for professional organizations. Two, absolutely use LinkedIn to connect, network, educate, and learn. And within your organization, your company, try to reach out and meet people within the organization. Those three things will help you have a successful post-military career as you define your own success.
Those are great tips. And I love what you said. It can come off a little odd that maybe you're always looking for your next job, but to kind of circle back to how we started is, if you're putting yourself out there, if you're making those connections, you don't know what twists and turns await, but you won't get those opportunities if no one knows who you are.
Absolutely, right. And that's where you're meeting folks, out there. And then that helps really kind of build that community of knowledge, and you'll find a lot of interesting things, because the military can be, a little bit, it's not a little bit, it's a culture onto itself. It's a big culture, right? Private sector is a lot bigger with a lot of different cultures.
Yeah. And I love, I didn't even have a LinkedIn until I was working for Power to Fly. And that's about 3 or 4 years ago now. I was like, oh, it's just a bunch, I don't know. And now, having been on it for a few years, you start to find people, if you put yourself up there, and people just start to find you. I don't know how those algorithms work, but they do seem to work, because my page now is people posting things that are very much of interest to me.
Yeah, I was listening to a podcast this morning, and they had found the connection on LinkedIn just that this week, and the podcast host invited her on. Right, that was a connection on LinkedIn. Right, it's a very good tool to meet people and learn. So yeah, for those who are, it's one of the first things that I do. The other thing about LinkedIn is, and I learned this early on, is you need to build your connections outside of those you normally work with, right? Because I was proud. I had a LinkedIn account, which a lot of people didn't back when I was transitioning. That said, hey, who are your LinkedIn people is that? It's all people I service. That all of them are still in the military. They're not going to help network. So he said, you need to find one non-military connection a day. And I made that an effort. And then, as you kind of mentioned, the algorithm really does work. It's expanded from there, but yeah, it's a powerful tool, and it's something that you can really use for yourself in many ways.
I love that, one new person a day. That's an easy, achievable goal and an easy win.
Well, it seems easy in retrospect. At the time, like, oh, I was a little bit of hand wringing
Oh,
on that,
sure.
but
Yeah.
it is measurable. It is very measurable, and
Measurable. That's the word.
yes. Now it's really easy if I wanted to achieve that, but yeah, but it is like one a day. Make it a goal. You can do it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's, I won't go too much more down the LinkedIn rabbit hole, but, and like using that as a way to like tell your story and talk to
Yeah.
them and, send a message and get that going. And it doesn't have to be I'm looking for a job, it's just like, hey, I'm building my network. And that's literally why everyone is on that platform, is to
Right.
do that. So
Right.
it's, to free, because I also felt that too. I was like, oh, it's like, who are these people? Who am I? But just like, that's literally why we're here. So
Right.
it's not a surprise to add someone.
Right. Absolutely,
Yeah.
it's not.
Yeah. So we have a few minutes left. I'd love to hear about, I mentioned in your bio earlier, have you yourself have hired over 100 people, members of the veteran, military spouse, and early career disabled communities at UHG. Have you seen those individuals then go on to shape the work at UHG?
I would say absolutely, in ways that I'd hoped, but exceeded it.
Mm,
Right, moving from individual contributor roles up to manager to director, helping propel these efforts forward. You definitely find the concept to pay it forward when you're doing that. So it's really nice. Just some of the initial people are now, 8, 9 years, and they're moving into senior roles, which is really what I wanted. The goal was really to see the organization with people who could grow and lead in the future. It's nice seeing that. And the retention from those groups has been exceedingly high, which is overcoming one of the stereotypes. So, and many of them to this day still work with me on these efforts, which is even better. In fact, in a little while, I'm going to Cal State University Fullerton to sit on a panel in a few hours. And one of the folks I recruit as part of the group is going to come with me and participate also. And that's really kind of powerful way of helping educate. And, other, in a small part, when I retired, military unemployment was higher than the general population in 13 or 14. And it's less now.
mm.
And there's been a lot of people working on it, but in a small way, I feel I've helped contribute to that literal change that the hiring and employment of veterans has works. But it took effort, but it's been great, small part, but it's great to be part of what we've changed today to end up there.
That's awesome. So awesome. We only have a couple of minutes left. So if you could give yourself one piece of advice when, there's that person, now you go back in time and you're going to be doing all these things. You're like, no way, I don't believe any of that. But just if you could go back and give yourself one piece of advice, what do you think that would be as you were transitioning into the private sector?
It's pretty easy. I'd say don't say you'll never do something, because this was about 5 or 6 years ago. I said that I pretty much am open to any role. I said, I don't know if like going to accounting I would love. I said, but there's one role I never want to have. I said, that's leading a contact center, right? And that's where I'm at. And I love it, right? So I told my boss that a few weeks ago, right? And so, yeah, I mean, I'm glad you talked about the twists and turns, right? Because it's almost a never say never. Certainly there's things I didn't expect I would do, but that was what I said. And yet here I am doing that exact role. And what I really like in the private sector is UHGs give me the freedom to, I say, to do some of my crazy ideas, to run a call center and contact center a little bit differently, right? And I love that freedom and flexibility. I mean, it's on me, my team, to make it successful. I have to own that if it doesn't work. But I like that flexibility to do that and have the team respond in what hopefully is a positive manner to those changes.
Awesome. Well, Kevin, this has been so fantastic. What is the best way for folks to keep the conversation going with you? I have a hunch. I think you're going to say LinkedIn.
You're gonna be right. I say find me on LinkedIn. There's two Kevin Traws. I say the smarter, better looking one is my son, who happens to work at Indeed. So like the jobs coming, yeah, not joking. So you can find me on LinkedIn. Happy, I'll accept your connection. Provide any support and information, whether you're looking for a job in healthcare, UHG, or otherwise. I can always provide advice and help. Again, I've helped more people outside of UHG than within UHG, which is how I think it should be for people working in this space.
I love that. So Kevin can be your one ad today. No sweat. Kevin's your one person.
You got
today.
it. One for the day.
All right, Kevin. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for making the time. This has been absolutely wonderful, and I hope we get to do it again someday.
Right. Thank you very much, Hunter. Appreciate it. Have a good one.
All right. You too.
Bye.
Take care.